In 1649, England was a land of change and uncertainty. The country had just seen the end of a king's reign and was still adjusting to a new order. Towns and villages were alive with whispers of war and stories of bravery. But amidst all this turmoil, an event took place that would change the course of history in the most unexpected way. In a quiet, small town in Somerset, a man named Robert Blake lived a simple life. He was a merchant, a trader of goods, someone who knew numbers, deals, and the rhythm of the marketplace better than the roar of cannons or the creak of a ship. And yet, fate had a strange plan for him. Robert Blake was 50 years old, an age when many thought of retiring or slowing down, of leaving adventures to the young and reckless. But Blake's life was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. One day, he received a letter, a summons unlike any he had ever expected. England needed a new leader for its fleet, a commander who would guide its ships through uncertain waters and face enemies that seemed invincible. And somehow, inexplicably, Robert Blake had been chosen. He had never commanded a ship. He had never fired a cannon. He had never led sailors into battle. And yet, there he was, about to take on one of the greatest responsibilities a person could ever have. Blake's neighbors were puzzled. His friends were astonished. Even Blake himself must have felt a shiver of doubt. How could a merchant, who spent his days counting coins and arranging shipments, become Admiral of the fleet, entrusted with the lives of hundreds of men and the security of the nation? But Blake was not a man to shrink from a challenge. Deep in his heart, he knew that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and accepted the task. Life in the merchant world had given him unexpected preparation. Blake had spent decades negotiating deals, solving problems, and thinking strategically. While he had no experience with warships, he had honed the art of patience, observation, and quick decision-making, skills that would become invaluable on the open seas. He understood people, and perhaps most importantly, he believed in the power of discipline and planning. These qualities, simple yet profound, would help him face challenges that even the most seasoned naval officers might have feared. Before Blake could command ships, he needed to understand them. He began visiting the fleet, walking along the docks, studying the old, worn vessels that would soon be under his command. He examined their sails, their rigging, their cannons. He watched the sailors move with practiced precision, noting their strengths and weaknesses. And slowly, Blake began to imagine not just how the ships floated, but how they could move as one, how they could fight as a single, unstoppable force. He did not yet know exactly how, but he could feel the possibilities unfolding in his mind. The townspeople would later recall seeing Blake walking along the harbor at dawn, the sky painted in soft pink and gold, the sea calm and endless before him. He would stand silently, eyes fixed on the horizon, imagining battles that had not yet been fought, strategies that had not yet been tested. Others were content to admire the ships as they were. Blake saw what they could become. It was not only the ships that Blake had to understand, but the men who sailed them. Sailors were proud and wary of newcomers, especially a leader who had never felt the wind whip through the rigging or heard the roar of cannon fire. Blake approached them with respect, not arrogance. He listened more than he spoke, learning their fears and hopes, their stories and skills. Slowly, he gained their trust. He was no longer just a merchant. He became a figure of authority, someone who could inspire loyalty through quiet confidence and clear vision. The world outside Somerset was dangerous. England faced enemies on the seas who were experienced, skilled, and ruthless. The Dutch Navy was feared across Europe. Spain still held treasures and fortresses that seemed impregnable. And yet, Blake did not see obstacles. He saw challenges. He did not see a merchant standing unarmed before warships. He saw an opportunity to learn, adapt, and, eventually, to triumph. And so, Robert Blake, a simple man from a quiet town, stepped into history with nothing but determination, intelligence, and courage. He prepared to take command of England's fleet. Little did the world know that this unassuming merchant would go on to revolutionize naval warfare, to defeat enemies that seemed invincible, and to leave a legacy that would shape the seas for centuries. Blake's journey was only beginning, but already the world could sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. A merchant had dared to dream of the sea, and soon that dream would change everything. After accepting the command of England's fleet, Robert Blake faced a reality far more complicated than he had ever imagined. While he had studied ships, observed sailors, and imagined strategies from the docks of Somerset, the true test of leadership awaited him in the chaos of war. England was in the midst of civil conflict, and towns across the country were besieged, their people caught between warring factions. Blake had no choice but to learn quickly, for every delay could cost lives. His first lessons in command came not on the open seas, but in the heart of the English countryside. In Lyme Regis, a small coastal town, the people were under siege. Soldiers loyal to the monarchy threatened to overwhelm the town, and the residents were terrified. Blake, though still a merchant in many ways, stepped into this unfamiliar battlefield with a calm determination. He did not rely on brute force alone. He relied on observation, planning, and the careful deployment of resources. He organized the town's defenses, instructed the defenders on how to use their limited supplies, and inspired courage in those who feared they would be overrun. At Taunton, the challenges grew even greater. The town faced repeated attacks, each more intense than the last. Blake's strategists had to adapt constantly. He studied the movements of the enemy, noting weaknesses and predicting their actions. He learned the importance of timing, of patience, and of knowing when to hold a line and when to strike. These experiences were teaching him lessons that no book or classroom could offer. He was learning leadership the hard way, through trial and error, through observation and intuition, through courage under pressure. Blake discovered that leadership was not about giving orders from a distance. It was about presence, about understanding the fears and hopes of those who followed you. He walked among the soldiers and townspeople, listening to their concerns, calming their anxieties, and encouraging them to believe in their own abilities. He showed that a calm mind could bring order to chaos, that clarity of thought could turn desperation into strategy. Slowly, the defenders began to trust him, not because of his title, but because of the steady confidence he displayed in every action. Through these sieges, Blake also learned the importance of creativity. Resources were limited, and conventional tactics were often impossible. He improvised weapons, reinforced weak points with clever engineering, and devised plans that took advantage of the terrain and the spirit of the people. Every challenge became an opportunity to innovate, every setback a lesson in resilience. In these small towns, facing overwhelming odds, Blake discovered the essential qualities that would later define him as a naval commander: patience, observation, decisiveness, and an unshakable belief in the power of strategy over sheer strength. Evenings in Lyme Regis and Taunton brought moments of quiet reflection for Blake. He would watch the sun sink behind the hills, the sky painted with hues of orange and purple, and consider the day's events. Each decision, each movement, Each small victory or setback became part of a larger understanding of command. He realized that leading people was as much about understanding their hearts as it was about controlling the battlefield. He began to see patterns in conflict, rhythms in human behavior, and the subtle ways in which courage could ripple outward, inspiring others to act beyond their own expectations. Blake's reputation began to grow. Soldiers spoke of his calm presence in the midst of chaos, of his ability to make difficult decisions with clarity, and of his relentless focus on the ultimate goal. Townspeople admired his courage, for he shared in their hardships rather than commanding from a safe distance. His influence spread not through fear, but through respect, trust, and the example he set. In these sieges, a merchant had transformed into a commander, and the lessons he learned on land would soon prepare him for even greater challenges at sea. Through these early experiences, Blake also discovered the importance of vision. He began to understand that a leader must see beyond the immediate moment, imagining not just the next step but the larger path to victory. He began to anticipate moves before they happened, to recognize opportunities in adversity, and to turn uncertainty into advantage. These were not skills that could be taught. They were forged through experience, honed by necessity, and tempered by the courage to act when others hesitated. By the time the sieges ended, Robert Blake had changed. The man who had walked along the quiet streets of Somerset, unsure of his abilities and hesitant in the face of the unknown, had become a leader capable of inspiring loyalty, commanding respect, and guiding others through the most desperate circumstances. He had learned that leadership required more than knowledge or titles. It required courage, imagination, and the ability to see the potential in both people and situations that others might overlook. As the towns were secured and England's conflicts continued, Blake's mind began to shift toward the sea. He understood the lessons he had learned on land, the value of strategy, the power of careful observation, the necessity of innovation, and the importance of inspiring trust, would soon be tested in a far more dangerous arena. The open waters awaited him, filled with enemies and unknown challenges, and Blake was ready. He had learned to lead, to think beyond the immediate, and to trust in his own judgment. He had discovered that even a merchant could become a commander when determination and intelligence guided every decision. Robert Blake had taken his first steps toward greatness. The sieges of Lyme Regis and Taunton had taught him patience, resilience, and the subtle art of leadership. They had shown him that courage could be cultivated, that innovation could overcome limitations, and that respect could command loyalty stronger than fear. And now, with the lessons of land battles etched into his mind, he was ready to bring those same skills to the vast and uncertain waters of the English seas, where history would soon remember him as a revolutionary commander who changed the world of naval warfare forever. After mastering the challenges of land, Robert Blake turned his attention to the sea, a vast and unpredictable realm that both terrified and fascinated him. Unlike the structured streets of Somerset or the fortified walls of Lyme Regis and Taunton, the ocean offered no boundaries. Waves could rise without warning. Storms could strike with sudden fury, and the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly, hiding enemies and opportunities alike. For a man who had spent his life trading goods and managing merchants, this was a world utterly foreign, and yet it was now his command. England's fleet, which Blake was to lead, was a patchwork of aging ships. Many were worn by years of neglect, their timbers creaking, their sails frayed, their cannons outdated. Sailors whispered of the Dutch Navy, a force considered unbeatable, and of the Spanish fleets that sailed with treasures and might that seemed impossible to challenge. Experienced officers doubted Blake. They questioned how a man who had never set foot on a warship could lead them against such foes. And perhaps Blake himself, in the quiet moments of dawn, wondered whether he had accepted a challenge too great for any one person. Yet Blake had learned lessons that no one could take from him. From the sieges, he knew the value of careful observation, patience, and strategy. He understood the importance of knowing his men, of earning their trust, and of using their strengths to their fullest advantage. He had discovered that obstacles were rarely insurmountable when met with clear thought, determination, and courage. And so, he faced the scene not with fear, but with quiet resolve, ready to transform uncertainty into opportunity. His first task was to inspect the fleet. He walked along the decks, feeling the rough ropes beneath his hands, listening to the creak of the timbers, and watching the sailors move with practiced skill. Though they were skeptical of their new commander, they could sense his intelligence and steadiness. Blake spoke little at first, preferring to learn and understand rather than impose. He asked questions, observed routines, and slowly began to shape the fleet not with orders alone, but with insight and vision. Blake realized immediately that traditional methods alone would not be enough. The Dutch and Spanish forces had centuries of naval experience, and England's fleet could not hope to match them ship for ship in conventional combat. If he were to succeed, he would need to invent new tactics, strategies that no one had tried before. He began to think in terms of movement, coordination, and timing. He considered how ships could support one another, how cannon could fire in unison, and how formation could be adjusted to maximize both offense and defense. It was a mind at work, seeing possibilities that others could not, imagining victories that seemed impossible to anyone else. At the same time, Blake worked to instill confidence in his men. He understood that fear could cripple even the best trained sailors, and that courage could be nurtured through trust and preparation. He spoke with them individually, listened to their concerns, and made them feel that their lives mattered not just to him, but to the fleet and the nation. Slowly, the sailors began to see that their commander was no ordinary man. He was calm in the face of uncertainty, deliberate in his planning, and unwavering in his commitment to their success. In this way, Blake built not only a fleet but a community of trust and purpose, where every man understood his role and the value of his contribution. The challenges of the open sea were relentless. Storms forced ships off course, cannons misfired, and supply shortages tested the endurance of both men and vessels. Blake adapted constantly, learning from every mistake and every success. He discovered that leadership on the ocean required not only courage and intelligence, but also flexibility and creativity. A single decision could mean the difference between survival and disaster, and he met each choice with calm deliberation, never allowing panic to guide him. Despite the enormity of the task before him, Blake saw the possibilities where others saw only danger. He imagined formations that could overwhelm even the most skilled enemy, strategies that would allow England's fleet to strike with precision, and movements that would turn weakness into strength. The impossible began to take shape in his mind as a plan, a vision that could be realized through determination, skill, and innovation. By the time he prepared to meet the Dutch fleet for the first time, Robert Blake was no longer simply a merchant-turned-commander. He was a strategist, a visionary, and a leader capable of transforming uncertainty into power. The sea, vast and unpredictable, had become a proving ground for his intellect and courage. He understood that victory would not come from brute force alone, but from careful planning, coordination, and the unshakable confidence that he and his men could overcome any challenge. As the horizon stretched before him, Blake felt both the weight of responsibility and the thrill of possibility. He knew that the battles ahead would test everything he had learned, and yet he was ready. England's fleet, once considered weak and outdated, was now a force shaped by his mind and leadership. And in the quiet moments before the first engagement, he could feel the calm of certainty in the midst of chaos, the steady belief that even the impossible could be achieved. Robert Blake was standing at the edge of history. The sea awaited, vast and unpredictable, and he was ready to face it with courage, intelligence, and vision. The impossible was no longer something to fear. It was something to master. As Robert Blake faced the vast expanse of the sea, he understood that traditional naval tactics were no longer enough. Ships often fought in chaotic clusters, with cannon fire scattered and sailors struggling to follow orders under the pressure of battle. Armies at sea were disorganized, and victories relied on luck as much as skill. Blake, however, believed that chaos could be transformed into order, that even a fleet of aging ships could fight with precision if guided by intelligence, discipline, and strategy. He began to experiment with formations, imagining how ships could move in unison, how they could fire their cannons in coordinated volleys, and how the fleet could act as a single entity rather than a collection of individual vessels. This was a radical idea. Many seasoned captains doubted him. They were accustomed to tradition, to tactics passed down over generations, and they were wary of Blake's untested methods. Yet he was undeterred. He believed that careful planning, rigorous training, and innovation could create an advantage greater than any number of cannons or cannons' weight. Blake called it the line of battle. In this formation, ships would sail in a straight line, each supporting the others, with their broadside cannons able to fire simultaneously on the enemy. By organizing the fleet in this way, he ensured that firepower was concentrated rather than wasted, that each ship's position strengthened the fleet's overall effectiveness. The line of battle allowed for both offense and defense, creating a flexible and formidable force capable of meeting even the most experienced opponents. He began to drill his sailors relentlessly. The men learned to maintain formation even in rough seas, to coordinate their movements with precision, and to trust not only in their own skills but in the position and timing of every other ship. Blake walked the decks himself, demonstrating, explaining, and correcting, earning the respect of his men not through fear, but through the clarity of his vision and the calm authority of his presence. Sailors who had once doubted a 50-year-old merchant now began to see him as a leader capable of changing the very nature of naval warfare. The innovations did not stop with formation alone. Blake considered wind, tides, and currents, adapting his strategies to use the sea itself as an ally. He experimented with timing and distance, learning how to maximize the effectiveness of cannon fire while minimizing the risk to his own ships. Every detail mattered. Every decision had consequences, and Blake approached each with patience, observation, and foresight. He understood that the mastery of the sea required both courage and intellect, and he applied both with unwavering determination. News of Blake's new tactics began to spread. Other commanders were skeptical, but they could not ignore the results of his careful experimentation. Ships that had once seemed vulnerable were now capable of coordinated maneuvers that could overwhelm superior forces. Sailors began to take pride in their fleet, seeing themselves not just as individuals on separate vessels, but as parts of a unified force moving toward a single purpose. The line of battle transformed both the fleet and its crew, creating confidence where there had once been fear and precision where there had once been chaos. Blake's innovations would not only win battles, they would change the very way wars were fought at sea. For centuries to come, admirals would study his methods, adapt them, and build upon them. The line of battle became a standard tactic, shaping naval engagements across the world, influencing great commanders such as Horatio Nelson and countless others who would follow. And it all began with a man who had never commanded a ship before the age of 50, a merchant who saw opportunity where others saw only disorder. Even as Blake's ideas took shape, he remained humble and focused. He understood that innovation required practice, that brilliance alone could not win battles without discipline and execution. He continued to train his men, refining maneuvers, anticipating problems, and building trust in both the strategy and the leader guiding it. Each day brought new challenges, from unpredictable weather to mechanical failures, but Blake met each with patience and resolve, turning obstacles into lessons, setbacks into preparation. Through this careful work, the fleet became more than a collection of ships. It became a living, breathing instrument of strategy. Blake's line of battle allowed England to face enemies who had once seemed invincible, giving hope to sailors who had known only fear. And as the first engagements tested these tactics in the uncertain and often violent conditions of naval combat, it became clear that Blake's vision was not merely theoretical. It was practical, effective, and revolutionary. By the time the fleet sailed to meet the Dutch Navy, Blake's preparations had transformed his command. A merchant from Somerset had become a strategist of unmatched skill, capable of leading his men with calm authority and unshakable confidence. The line of battle was ready, the sailors were trained, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would prove that innovation, courage, and leadership could overcome experience and reputation. Robert Blake had taken the first steps toward forever changing naval warfare. The line of battle was more than a tactic. It was a symbol of his vision, a manifestation of his belief that intelligence, preparation, and trust could turn the impossible into reality. And as the horizon stretched endlessly before him, he knew that the battles to come would test every lesson he had learned, but also that his fleet, moving as one, was ready to meet the challenge. The day had arrived when Robert Blake's fleet would face its greatest test yet. The Dutch Navy, long considered the most skilled and formidable force in Europe, sailed toward England with confidence born of centuries of dominance at sea. Their ships were well built, their captains experienced, and their crews seasoned by countless battles. Many observers believed that no fleet could hope to defeat them, and yet Blake's men, trained in his revolutionary tactics and guided by his calm authority, prepared to challenge the impossible. Blake stood on the deck of his flagship, eyes scanning the horizon, his mind calculating every possible move. Unlike previous commanders who relied on instinct or brute force, Blake relied on strategy. The line of battle, carefully drilled in practice, would give his fleet a distinct advantage. Ships would sail in a coordinated formation, firing broadsides in unison, supporting one another, and maintaining order even in the chaos of battle. It was a method no Dutch captain had ever faced, and Blake knew that surprise, precision, and timing would be his greatest allies. The wind was steady, carrying the scent of salt and the promise of comfort to cross the waves. Sailors moved with disciplined efficiency, adjusting sails, loading cannons, and taking their positions. They had trained for this moment, drilled tirelessly under Blake's watchful eye, and now they were ready to put his vision to the test. Fear still lingered in some hearts, but it was tempered by trust. They believed in their commander, in the strategy, and in the strength of unity that Blake had instilled. As the fleets drew closer, Blake's calm presence steadied the men. He gave clear commands, his voice measured and precise, guiding each ship into position. The Dutch, confident in their superiority, advanced with pride. They expected the chaos of traditional naval combat, the unpredictable outcomes of ships clashing in disorder. Instead, they were met with coordination, control, and an unyielding formation that held firm even as cannons roared and the air filled with smoke. The battle unfolded with intensity, yet Blake's fleet maintained its discipline. Each ship followed the line of battle, moving in harmony with his companions, firing volleys in perfect synchronization. The concentrated firepower struck the Dutch with a force they had not anticipated. Ships that had once seemed invincible now faced a new reality, a fleet that fought as one, guided by strategy rather than chaos. Blake's vision was proving its worth. Amid the clash of wooden cannon, Blake remained composed. He adjusted his tactics as needed, anticipating enemy movements, reinforcing weak points, and exploiting openings. His ability to see the larger picture while attending to the details of each engagement was unmatched. The sailors trusted him implicitly, responding to his commands with precision, moving as extensions of his strategic mind. The Dutch, skilled though they were, found themselves challenged by coordination they had never encountered and a determination they could not break. Hours passed as the battle raged. The sea churned with the weight of ships, and smoke curled across the waves. Yet Blake's fleet held steady, maintaining formation, delivering sustained fire, and protecting one another with unwavering discipline. Slowly, the tide of the encounter shifted. Dutch ships faltered under the relentless, coordinated attack. Crews that had expected an easy victory now struggled to respond to the organized precision of Blake's tactics. Confidence gave way to confusion, and the reputation of invincibility began to crack. By the end of the engagement, the results were undeniable. Blake's fleet had not only withstood the might of the Dutch Navy, but it had also inflicted decisive damage, forcing the enemy to retreat. Sailors on both sides could scarcely believe what had happened. The untested tactics of a 50-year-old merchant had prevailed against the greatest naval force of the age. England had a new hero, and Blake had proven that intelligence, preparation, and innovation could triumph over experience and tradition. The victory did more than secure immediate success. It transformed the way naval warfare was understood. The line of battle, once a radical experiment, had been validated in the crucible of real combat. Commanders across Europe began to take notice, realizing that Blake had introduced a method that could change the outcome of battle for generations. England's fleet, once considered outdated and vulnerable, now stood as a symbol of strategic brilliance and disciplined execution. Blake himself remained humble, understanding that one victory did not guarantee the future. He continued to refine tactics, train his men, and anticipate the challenges that lay ahead. Yet, in the quiet moments after the battle, he allowed himself a brief reflection. A merchant from Somerset, who had never commanded a ship before the age of 50, had faced the impossible and triumphed. He had taken untested ideas and turned them into reality, and in doing so, had reshaped the world of naval warfare forever. This victory also strengthened the bond between Blake and his sailors. They had seen their commander face fear, uncertainty, and a powerful enemy with clarity and courage. They had witnessed the power of preparation, trust, and unity. And in that shared experience, they found not only respect but loyalty and belief in what they could achieve together. Blake had shown them that even the most daunting challenges could be overcome with strategy, discipline, and vision. As the smoke cleared and the waves settled, Blake looked toward the horizon, aware that even greater challenges awaited. The Dutch were not the only foes England would face. Spain and other powers still posed threats, their fleets formidable and their ports well defended. Yet Blake's mind was ready. He had learned that the impossible could be met with preparation and courage, and that a fleet moving as one could achieve what had once seemed unthinkable. Robert Blake's victory against the Dutch was more than a battle won. It was a declaration of his vision, his leadership, and his unwavering belief in the power of strategy. From this moment on, England's fleet would sail with confidence, guided by tactics that would endure for centuries. And in the quiet of the evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sea reflected the glow of victory, Blake allowed himself a small, knowing smile. A merchant had changed the fate of a nation and the course of history. After his remarkable victory against the Dutch, Robert Blake knew that the sea still held greater challenges. England's enemies were many, and one in particular loomed large in his mind: Spain. The Spanish Empire, rich with treasures from the Americas, maintained fleets that carried gold, silver, and goods worth fortunes. These treasure fleets were guarded by forts, cannons, and seasoned sailors. Many considered them untouchable, a symbol of wealth protected by overwhelming firepower. But Blake, who had already transformed the impossible into triumph once, saw opportunity where others saw risk. Blake studied the Spanish harbors carefully, learning everything he could about their defenses. One port, Santa Cruz de Tenerife in the Canary Islands, was said to be impregnable. 60 cannons lined its walls, and 7 forts stood sentinel over the harbor. Any attempt to attack it would seem suicidal to the bravest commander. Yet Blake, undeterred, began to formulate a plan. He would not rely on brute force alone. Instead, he would use strategy, surprise, and the ingenuity that had already won him victories against the Dutch. His fleet approached the harbor with caution, every movement deliberate, every decision carefully weighed. Sailors felt the tension in the air, but they also trusted their commander. Blake had taught them to move as one, to act with discipline, and to believe in the power of coordination. They knew that the success of the mission depended on their skill, their unity, and their faith in the man who had already turned impossible battles into victories. As they neared Santa Cruz, Blake assessed the fortifications and positions of the Spanish ships. He realized that a direct assault would be too costly, that charging headlong into the harbor under the guns of 60 cannons would lead to disaster. Instead, he devised a plan that relied on timing, precision, and relentless courage. He would position his ships to exploit the weaknesses in the harbor's defenses, striking where the Spanish did not expect. This was a test of not only bravery but of intellect, for one mistake could cost hundreds of lives. The attack began with careful maneuvering. Blake's ships moved as one, their formation precise, their fire coordinated. Cannons roared, sending smoke curling across the water, but Blake's fleet held steady. Every ship knew its role, every sailor executed his part, and the line of battle became a living instrument of strategy. The Spanish, confident in their stronghold, were surprised by the organized precision and daring of Blake's assault. Each broadside struck with accuracy, weakening defenses and creating openings for further action. Blake's calm leadership was evident throughout the engagement. While cannon fire thundered around him, he made decisions with clarity, adjusting tactics, reinforcing positions, and exploiting every opportunity. His sailors followed without hesitation, trusting his judgment and moving as an extension of his mind. In this daring attack, Blake's intelligence proved as powerful as any cannon. The treasure fleet, once thought untouchable, was now vulnerable under the coordinated strategy of England's Admiral. Hours passed in the chaos of battle, yet Blake's fleet maintained discipline. Ships supported each other. Firepower was concentrated effectively, and the sailors executed maneuvers they had drilled countless times. Slowly, the Spanish defenses began to crumble. Forts that had seemed unassailable were battered by precise cannon fire, and the treasure-laden ships were neutralized. Blake's vision had turned what many believed impossible into a reality. By the end of the engagement, the Spanish fleet was destroyed, and England had seized a victory that resonated far beyond the harbor. This triumph was more than a military success. It demonstrated the power of strategy, preparation, and innovation. Blake had shown that even the most formidable defenses could be overcome through careful planning, disciplined execution, and unwavering courage. The victory at Santa Cruz de Tenerife became legendary, a testament to what a determined mind and a unified fleet could achieve. Sailors celebrated their success, and England's reputation at sea grew stronger with every tale of Blake's daring and brilliance. Blake himself remained humble. He understood that fortune favored the prepared, that victories were not just a result of bravery, but of thought, observation, and the ability to act decisively in moments of uncertainty. He continued to refine his tactics, to study enemy movements, and to train his men, knowing that the sea always held new challenges. Yet in the quiet moments after the battle, he allowed himself the satisfaction of knowing that a man who had begun life as a merchant had struck at one of the greatest fleets of the world and succeeded. The attack on the Spanish treasure fleet also strengthened Blake's legacy. He had proven that age, experience, or convention did not define success. Courage, intellect, preparation, and innovation could overcome the strongest defenses. Sailors who had witnessed his leadership carried the lessons forward, and the tactics used at Santa Cruz would influence naval strategy for generations. Blake's name, though not always remembered in the popular histories of kings and empires, had already begun to shape the world in profound ways. As the sun set over the harbor, reflecting golden fire on the calm waters, Blake looked toward the horizon. He knew that further challenges awaited him, that the sea was filled with dangers yet unseen, and that enemies would continue to test England's fleet. Yet he also knew that he had proven something essential, that even the most daunting obstacles could be overcome by courage, strategy, and determination. The impossible had been conquered once again, and Robert Blake was proving that the limits of what could be achieved were defined only by vision and resolve. By the time Robert Blake had secured victories against both the Dutch and the Spanish treasure fleet, the man who had once been a simple merchant from Somerset had fully transformed. He was no longer simply a commander learning the ropes of warfare. He had become a master of strategy, a visionary leader, and a figure whose influence stretched far beyond the ships under his direct control. England's fleet, once considered outdated and vulnerable, had been reshaped into a cohesive and disciplined force, capable of executing complex maneuvers and striking fear into even the most formidable opponents. Blake understood that command was not measured solely in victories or in the destruction of enemy fleets. True command required the ability to inspire, to cultivate loyalty, and to instill confidence in every man who served under one's leadership. He had learned this in the sieges of Lyme Regis and Taunton, where trust and careful coordination had turned civilians and soldiers alike into effective defenders. Now, at sea, these lessons were magnified. His sailors faced not only the dangers of cannon fire and treacherous waters, but also the uncertainty of the unknown. Blake's presence, calm yet commanding, reassured them. It reminded them that discipline, training, and mutual trust could overcome fear, chaos, and overwhelming odds. In his role as Admiral, Blake took a deeply personal approach to leadership. He was never content with issuing orders from afar. He walked the decks of his ships, spoke with officers and men alike, and observed operations firsthand. He learned the strengths and weaknesses of his captains, adjusted assignments based on individual skills, and ensured that every sailor felt valued and understood. Blake believed that a fleet could only perform at its best when each man knew not only his role, but also the reasoning behind it. This combination of clarity, empathy, and strategic oversight created a unity within the fleet that was as powerful as any cannon or broadside. Blake's reputation as a leader of unmatched vision and discipline spread quickly. Other nations began to notice the transformation in England's naval power, and whispers of his brilliance reached far and wide. Yet Blake remained focused, never allowing fame or reputation to distract him from the task at hand. He continued to innovate, refining formations, experimenting with tactics, and studying the movement of enemy fleets. He understood that complacency could be as dangerous as an opposing navy, and that the sea offered no permanent victories, only opportunities for those willing to observe, adapt, and act. One of Blake's greatest strengths was his ability to balance strict discipline with flexibility. He demanded precision and adherence to plan, yet he also encouraged initiative within the framework of strategy. His captains were trained to think independently when circumstances changed, to anticipate enemy actions, and to execute maneuvers with confidence. This balance created a fleet that was both cohesive and adaptable, capable of responding to unexpected challenges without losing structure or purpose. Under Blake's command, the English Navy became a living system, a network of ships and sailors moving with intelligence, coordination, and shared purpose. Blake's personal habits reinforced his authority and his vision. He rose early, studied maps, and reviewed reports of past engagements with meticulous attention to detail. He met with his officers regularly, discussing strategy, logistics, and the practicalities of operating ships under harsh conditions. Every decision, from the smallest tactical maneuver to the allocation of resources, was informed by careful observation and critical thinking. His example taught his men that leadership was not a matter of rank alone, but a continuous engagement, thoughtful planning, and unwavering commitment to duty. Even as Blake mastered the art of command, he remained acutely aware of the limits of human endurance. Long campaigns at sea tested the physical and mental resilience of both officers and sailors. Blake paid close attention to provisions, rest schedules, and the morale of his men. He knew that a fleet could only fight effectively if it was healthy, well-supplied, and mentally prepared. By attending to these practical needs, he strengthened not only the physical readiness of his fleet, but also the trust and loyalty of every individual under his command. The age of command for Blake was not limited to victories on the water. It extended to the creation of a culture of excellence. Training programs became more rigorous, drills more precise, and standards of conduct higher. Sailors learned to take pride in their service, to respect their ships and their comrades, and to understand that every action, no matter how small, contributed to the success of the fleet. Blake had created an environment where intelligence, skill, and courage were rewarded, and where innovation and initiative were not just encouraged but essential. Through his leadership, Blake also forged alliances and networks that extended the influence of England's navy. He communicated with political leaders, coordinated with other military forces, and ensured that the Navy's actions aligned with the broader strategic goals of the country. In this way, he transformed England's fleet into not only a military force but a strategic instrument, capable of shaping events far beyond the battles themselves. His vision extended beyond the immediate horizon, imagining a navy that could dominate the seas for decades, guiding trade, protecting the homeland, and projecting power where it was needed most. Despite his growing power and influence, Blake remained grounded in his roots. He never allowed pride or arrogance to cloud his judgment. He remembered the lessons of Lyme Regis and Taunton, where courage and ingenuity had overcome adversity, and he treated every challenge, no matter how daunting, with the same careful attention and determination. He also never stopped learning. Each engagement, each storm, each encounter with the enemy offered insights that he absorbed and applied to future situations. His mind was always active, turning experience into knowledge, knowledge into strategy, and strategy into action. As Blake's fleet patrolled the waters, engaging enemies and protecting England's interests, the full impact of his leadership became clear. He had not only achieved victories at sea, but had established principles of command that would endure long after his time. Discipline, preparation, innovation, and the cultivation of human potential became the foundation of England's naval power. His sailors moved with confidence, knowing they were part of a system greater than themselves, guided by a leader who had proven time and again that intelligence, courage, and vision could overcome even the greatest obstacles. Robert Blake had entered the Navy as a merchant with no experience at sea. By the age of 50, he had transformed into a commander whose influence extended far beyond his own fleet. He had shaped the culture, strategy, and effectiveness of England's Navy, laying the groundwork for the dominance that would endure for centuries. The age of command was his to define, and through it, he demonstrated that leadership was not inherited, nor merely a matter of tradition or title, but a matter of vision, courage, and relentless pursuit of excellence. As the sun set over the calm waters, Blake reflected on the journey that had brought him from the quiet streets of Somerset to the command of England's fleet. He had faced doubt, danger, and the impossible, yet he had emerged as a leader of unmatched skill and vision. The age of command was not simply a period of victories. It was the embodiment of a philosophy, a way of thinking and acting that would guide sailors for generations to come. Robert Blake had proven that greatness was not defined by birth or experience, but by the courage to act, the intelligence to plan, and the determination to see a vision through to reality. Robert Blake's life and career had become legend by the time he reached the later years of his service. The merchant who had never commanded a ship before the age of 50 had transformed himself into one of the most innovative and respected naval commanders in history. Yet Blake's achievements were not measured solely in victories or destroyed fleets. His true legacy lay in the principles he established, the strategies he invented, and the example he set for generations of sailors who would follow in his wake. Blake's influence began with his revolutionary approach to naval tactics. The line of battle, once an untested idea, had proven itself against the Dutch and Spanish fleets. This method of coordinated fire, disciplined formations, and mutual support became the foundation of modern naval combat. Admirals of the future studied Blake's strategies, adapting them for new ships, larger fleets, and different contexts. Horatio Nelson, centuries later, would owe part of his success at Trafalgar to principles first demonstrated by Blake. In this way, Blake's innovations reached far beyond his own era, shaping the very nature of naval warfare for hundreds of years. But Blake's legacy was not only tactical, it was also human. He had shown that leadership was more than issuing orders. It was about understanding people, cultivating trust, and inspiring loyalty. Sailors who had once doubted him became fierce defenders of his strategies, confident in both their skills and their commander's judgment. Officers learned to think independently within a framework of discipline, making decisions that enhanced the effectiveness of the fleet. Blake had created a culture in which intelligence, initiative, and courage were valued equally, and that culture would continue to define the Royal Navy long after his time. The lessons of Blake's life also extended to courage in the face of the impossible. From the sieges of Lyme Regis and Taunton to the battles at sea and the daring attack on Santa Cruz de Tenerife, Blake demonstrated that boldness combined with preparation could overcome even the most daunting odds. He had faced fleets considered invincible, harbors deemed impregnable, and challenges that would have discouraged any ordinary commander. Yet through intelligence, strategy, and relentless determination, he succeeded. This courage became a model for future leaders, a reminder that fear could be managed and transformed into opportunity when paired with careful planning and skill. Blake's attention to detail and innovation also left a lasting mark. Every maneuver, every cannon placement, and every training drill reflected his meticulous mind. He understood that victories were rarely the result of luck alone. They were the product of preparation, foresight, and continuous refinement. By embedding this philosophy into the fabric of England's Navy, he ensured that the lessons he learned would continue to guide sailors and commanders long after his own time. Ships became more than vessels. They became instruments of strategy. Their crews coordinated, disciplined, and prepared for the unexpected. Another aspect of Blake's legacy was his ability to integrate intelligence and logistics into command. He understood that a fleet's strength depended not only on tactics in battle, but also on planning, supply management, and communication. His innovations in signaling, coordination, and operational discipline allowed fleets to act as cohesive units rather than isolated ships. This systems approach became a hallmark of the Royal Navy, enabling it to expand its influence, protect trade, and project power across the globe for centuries. Blake's achievements were recognized in his lifetime, yet he remained humble, never seeking fame for its own sake. He was motivated by duty, by the challenge of improving his fleet and defending his country, and by the belief that intelligent strategy and disciplined execution could accomplish what seemed impossible. His example inspired not only the men under his command, but also future generations of naval officers who saw in him the embodiment of leadership defined by skill, courage, and vision. Even as the years passed and new commanders rose to prominence, Blake's influence remained. His tactics were taught in naval academies, his strategies studied in war rooms, and his victories recounted as lessons in courage and innovation. Admirals who never knew him personally carried forward his principles, adapting them to new technology, new ships, and new conflicts. In this way, Robert Blake became more than commander of his own era. He became a symbol of what was possible when intellect, determination, and leadership were combined with courage and vision. Blake's personal story also inspired those beyond the Navy. He proved that greatness was not determined by birth, rank, or early experience. A merchant from a small Somerset town had risen to command a fleet, defeat enemies considered unbeatable, and reshape naval warfare forever. This message resonated beyond England, demonstrating that innovation, perseverance, and courage could redefine the limits of human achievement. Even today, historians and naval scholars recognize Blake's extraordinary contributions. His name may not always be as familiar as other figures in popular history, but his influence is undeniable. The principles he established, the line of battle, the integration of strategy with discipline, and the emphasis on human potential continue to inform naval doctrine, training, and leadership. Blake's legacy is not simply in the victories he won, but in the enduring lessons he left behind, lessons that continue to guide, inspire, and challenge leaders centuries later. As Robert Blake looked back on his life, he could see the path he had traveled, from a quiet merchant navigating the streets of Somerset to a commander shaping the course of nations on the open sea. He had faced doubt, fear, and impossible odds, yet he had succeeded through vision, courage, and relentless determination. His fleet had become a model of discipline, innovation, and strategic brilliance. His victories had reshaped naval warfare and secured England's position on the seas. And perhaps most importantly, he had shown that leadership, when exercised with intelligence, empathy, and vision, could transcend limitations and leave a legacy that endured far beyond the life of any individual. Robert Blake's story is a reminder that true influence is measured not only by immediate accomplishments, but by the ideas, principles, and culture one leaves behind. He had transformed the impossible into reality, and in doing so, had shaped the world in ways that would echo for centuries. The merchant who became a master of the sea had become a legend, not only for what he achieved, but for the enduring impact of his vision, courage, and leadership. Robert Blake's life, though extraordinary, was not celebrated in the way many heroes are remembered. Unlike kings or politicians whose names filled history books, Blake's legacy was quieter, embedded in strategy, innovation, and the disciplined men he had trained. Yet his influence on naval warfare was profound and enduring. He had transformed England's fleet, invented tactics that would define battle for centuries, and demonstrated that courage, intellect, and vision could conquer the impossible. Blake's later years were marked by continued service and tireless dedication. He remained at sea, overseeing fleets, training sailors, and refining the tactics that had brought him victory after victory. Even as age approached, his mind was sharp, always analyzing, always imagining new ways to gain advantage, to outthink enemies, and prepare his men for challenges yet unseen. His authority was unquestioned, yet his leadership remained humble and focused on the success of the fleet rather than personal glory. Though he achieved remarkable victories, defeating the Dutch Navy when it was considered invincible, attacking the heavily fortified Spanish harbor at Santa Cruz de Tenerife, and refining the line of battle formation, Blake did not seek fame. He was a man of action, not of ceremony, and history, for reasons beyond his control, did not always give him the attention he deserved. Yet in the eyes of those who served under him, and in the fleets he transformed, his presence was unmistakable. Sailors trusted him implicitly, and officers relied on his insight and judgment. England's navy had been reshaped, and the influence of his decisions would persist long after he was gone. Blake's personal qualities set him apart. He combined patience, observation, and foresight with decisiveness, courage, and a deep understanding of human nature. He could inspire loyalty without coercion, build trust without promises of fame, and cultivate skill through careful guidance and example. He believed that knowledge, preparation, and innovation were as vital as cannon fire, and that disciplined, confident sailors could achieve feats that brute force alone could never accomplish. This approach not only won battles, but created a lasting culture within the Royal Navy, one that valued intelligence, training, and leadership as much as courage and strength. Even in retirement, Blake's influence continued. Officers and sailors who were trained under him carried his methods forward, ensuring that his principles guided fleets long after his own command ended. The line of battle formation became standard practice, shaping naval engagements for generations. The tactics he pioneered influenced the great admirals who came after him, including figures who would lead England to victory in battle that defined entire eras. Blake's ideas endured because they worked. They were tested in combat, refined through experience, and grounded in careful observation and practical application. Yet despite these achievements, history sometimes forgot him. While the glory of victories passed into the names of kings or the headlines of political events, Blake's contribution remained a quiet truth, evident to those who studied tactics and naval history but often overlooked in popular accounts. He was remembered more by the fleets he commanded, the victories he secured, and the strategies he created than by monuments or pageantry. And perhaps, in a way, this suited him. Blake had never sought fame. He had sought mastery, innovation, and the effective command of his fleet. His reward was in the success of his sailors, the victories won, and the enduring influence of his ideas. Blake's story also reminds us that extraordinary impact does not always come from early advantage or privilege. He began life as a merchant, unfamiliar with the ways of the sea and inexperienced in command. Yet through determination, intellect, courage, and the relentless pursuit of excellence, he transformed himself and, through him, transformed England's navy. His journey illustrates the power of vision and the capacity of an individual to change the course of history, even when recognition is delayed or muted. In the quiet moments, when the sea was calm and the sun painted the horizon with shades of gold and crimson, Blake's influence lingered in every disciplined movement, every coordinated volley of cannon fire, and every officer who applied his principles in battle. His life had been a testament to the power of preparation, courage, and innovation, and though he might not always be remembered with fanfare, his presence endured in the fleets he shaped. Robert Blake, the merchant who became an admiral, the innovator who reshaped naval warfare, and the leader who inspired trust and excellence, had left a mark that time could not erase. His victories, his tactics, and his principles will continue to guide sailors, shape battles, and influence strategy for generations. Though history sometimes whispers his name rather than proclaims it, the legacy of Blake is permanent, a reminder that brilliance, courage, and vision can change a world, even when the world does not immediately notice. And so, as the waves carried England's fleets across the oceans Blake had once commanded, his spirit sailed with them, quiet, steady, and enduring. The man who had faced the impossible, who had conquered fear and chaos with strategy and intelligence, remained a guiding force, a master of the sea whose lessons would echo forever.